Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first of the parallel sessions. The room is a bit warm,
Yeah, I'm just checking up.
so that also might induce some soporific events.
Heated discussions.
Welcome, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, to the second part of this morning. And we're going to talk about global and regional competitiveness of enterprises in South Asia. This is a good, pretty direct follow-on to the plenary session, which I hope you attended. And I was really struck by the comments from Shekar Shah, the chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. And it struck home for a number of reasons. I haven't been part of all the 5 South Asia Economic Summits, but I almost came to the first one and couldn't at the last minute, and I've attended a couple in between. And the conversations this morning were very different from the conversations that have been happening in the previous summits. So I thought, since this is about competitiveness, we have at least, well, we don't have that many people from the private sector here, but nonetheless, I hope we can doff our think tank hats off and talk about why there's a huge gap between East Asia and South Asia in the nature of the firms that perform or do not perform in this region. We've just had the handout given to us. I don't have it with me, it's probably in my bag, but it talks about the Asian tigers, dynamic ASEAN, and it says lagging, but I would have said limpid SAARC, or limp SAARC. So the question is why? And I hope each of us, in our contributions, in our 8 minutes that I'm going to allocate to each of my panelists, can really sharply draw some of the reasons, some reasons that are endemic to the private sector. But as somebody reminded us on the panel, I think it was Babar Ali, what about the diaspora? They're made of the same DNA. They seem to be doing rather well wherever they go, whether it's Australia, Hong Kong, the US, UK, Ukraine, wherever. So it's not genetics. If it's not genetics, then is it the environment? And if so, what results in the environment in which the private sector functions? So I hope we can dig into, and at the end of the session, leave the organizers with some clear thoughts for how the next South Asia Economic Summit might tackle this topic of the private sector and its competitiveness in South Asia. With that, I'm going to start my clock and turn to my first panelist, Rashmi Banga. Rashmi is now in Switzerland at UNCTAD, and I'll stop there. More details in the CV that everybody has, and then Google has lots more on her. So, Rashmi.
Thank you, Chair. And after listening...
You can call me Shekar.
Okay, thank you, Shekar.
I don't look like a chair. I'm hopefully not a chair.
I think after listening to you, I just folded whatever my think tank cap wanted me to say. So I think I'll just come directly to the question of why we are, I'll start with a statement based on facts. South Asian firms are losing their global competitiveness to China, not only in global markets, but also in their domestic markets. They are losing, we keep talking about, imports from China. All of us, when we were at dinner, we were talking about, a lot of imports coming from China. But if you look at the figures, you will find even in our traditional export-oriented industries like textile and clothing, like leather products, we are losing our domestic market share. Imports from China has increased from 5% to 45%. It is just a figure to show the kind of grave situation we are in. I think we've been discussing of things for the past 30 years, but I don't think if we just keep discussing, in the next 3 years, we will have anything left to discuss. So manufacturing sector is losing its competitiveness. There is an urgent need to do something. And now coming to the reason, there are a lot of national reasons, policy, environment, but I'll come to the global reason. Global reason is that the way production is happening, the way trading is happening, there is a new trend, new way of doing, producing, and exporting. And these are the global value chains. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of global value chains. Nowadays, if you say you are exporting more of manufactured products, it does not mean you're producing more of manufactured products. You might be importing and then exporting with very little value addition. What is happening in China? China is the epicenter of global value chains of the West. Now, these global value chains are initiated by developed countries, and the most gains of global value chains go to the developed countries. There is a new data set by WTO and OECD. We have used that data set, and what we try to do, we try to see what is the total value addition generated in global value chains in all sectors, and what is the share of each country's. 70% of share of global value goes to OECD countries, 14% to BRICS, out of which 9% goes to China. Only 8% of total value generated is distributed among all other countries, all developing countries, which include all South Asian countries other than India, which includes LDCs. What competitiveness are we talking about? Can we compete in such a scenario? Now, why is this happening? Why is it that all value, the maximum value goes to OECD countries and all other countries are left with just 10 to 14% of total value generated in global value chains? The answer is the smiley curve, which means that services component of manufactured products is where the maximum value is, where the maximum value goes to. So if you are providing services, pre-manufacturing and post-manufacturing services, you are gaining the most. Now, our study shows that in a manufactured product, if it is of $100, only $14 is added by the manufactured product. The rest goes into R&D, the branding, the designing, the distribution, marketing. And that is where the developed countries have the most important grasp on. And that is the reason why, in spite of increasing our manufacturing and doing so well, having competitiveness in our traditional export-oriented industries, when we actually come to the share that we are not getting much value. I think we need to change our thinking on increasing exports to increasing production. And regional value chains are a very important component and I think a very important solution to the problem of South Asia. And we tried to see, is it possible to have regional value chains? And we found that in sectors like textile and clothing, leather and leather products, and agro-based industries, they are very much possible. Our studies, which we were hoping to launch in this summit, but we were not able to, we have done studies with Commonwealth Secretariat and Asian Development Bank, and we have given 3 lists to each country in South Asia. What they can export, what they are most competitive in exporting to the region, what are the inputs that they can procure from the region at a lower cost compared to what they are importing globally right now, what are the products and inputs where they need investments from the region and where they can make investments. So it's futile to say, we are competing, so we cannot have a regional value chain. I think we have to cooperate rather than compete to really become globally competitive. And I would, try to just urge the panelists as well as the audience to rethink in terms of, the competitiveness, not in terms of trade figures, but in terms of production. And it is not fragmentation of production any longer. Each country should try to export whatever it can, the finished products, but the raw materials and inputs should be sourced regionally. And we have seen that it is possible to source your inputs at a lower cost, and then you can compete in your domestic markets, in your international markets, and we need to have some policies. We have tried, I just talked about the Regional Industry Association. We need a regional investment agreement. We need harmonization of technical standards, and we also need to have a minimum acceptable standard agreement within the region so that there is a free movement of inputs and outputs. I think we have some specific policies in our studies, but we need more brains to be put into this issue of regional value chains and use regional value chains to compete globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. Give you a round of applause. That sets up the stage very nicely for us. I'd like you to think a little bit about what are the kind of firms and what are the kind of workers who can actually make global value chains or global production sharing possible. Think about the average worker in a factory producing this machine, the iPad in China. Compare that with the average worker in a reasonably sized enterprise maybe of 100, 200, whatever the average in your country is. The average in my country is about 9 or 10 when you look at the size of firms. Think about that and think about how we will be able to meet the challenge that Rashmi has just set for us. I'm now going to turn to Dave Nathan. Dave is at the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi and has also consulted very widely.
Thank you. Well, Rashmi covered a lot of what I would have liked to say, so I'll skip that part of it. Thanks
That's
for
not an
doing that.
excuse.
So I'll go to the next part, which is, I mentioned it a little briefly in the open session, which we had just before. That is, I think it's time for us to now go from looking at how we go up into and enter or move up value chain into how do we build value chains. And here I think I would like to start with two examples where India has done very successfully. It very successfully disrupted the world market in two areas. The first is that of generic drug production, where it was able to use the fact that we had a patent system that allowed only process and not product patents to come in with generic drugs, which have brought down prices all over the world. And India now accounts for more than half of the drugs that are imported by the US and the EU. That's one. The other area that India has successfully disrupted the world market is that in IT software services, where again the Indian firms innovated what's called the global delivery model, which is now being done by everybody else, even Accenture or IBM and everybody have had to copy the Indian model. Now, the point is that process innovations give you very limited rents for a short period of time because the processes cannot be patented. So therefore, everybody can copy your business process. Others also have come in, whether it is in the generic drugs or in IT software services. So you find that the Indian companies, for instance, are facing huge problems of how do they keep growing. You would know the crisis in Infosys, they tried a certain policy and then they're not sure whether to go along that. But the point is, in some way, you have to move from process to product patents. Finally, that's where the dynamic rents are, not in the manner of rent seeking, which is like the bureaucratic position, but of oligopolistic or monopolistic rents, which you get because of innovations. And we have to look at how do we get more of that. What was mentioned, what Rashmi mentioned, the smiley curve, also goes around in the other way, that if you don't move from that mid-level segment to the high value capturing segments, you can't increase. This is exactly the middle income trap in which the Latin American countries have been for a long time. Sri Lanka is a middle income country, India has just come into being one, and we will all soon face this problem. How do we go up this from middle income to higher status? We have to go to higher value capturing segments. I don't say value added because I don't think that's the correct thing. Who captures the value? I don't think Walmart adds that value which they get, that 66. They capture it because of a certain market position they have. So which are the areas in which South Asia can go? Unfortunately, my knowledge is a little more on India, so I can't say too much about the other countries. But I know Sri Lanka has very successfully moved from a kind of commoditized tea through Dilma into packaged tea, which is much, much higher value. And they've established a brand. Dilma is now a well-known brand around the world, Dilma tea. Now, the question is, I think there's a certain area in which the South Asian economies can move, particularly India, and that is what's now being called frugal engineering. That, you know, we have a long history of having a shortage of every kind of product, input, and therefore when I speak to our Indian industrialists, they say, look, we've always had to make do with less. So we're very good at making do with less, and that's now been given the term frugal engineering. This was the term, I think, coined by the CEO of Nissan Renault, the Brazilian, Carlos Ghosn, who used the term frugal engineering to talk about the Indian system of engineering. What is frugal engineering? We usually think of two inputs into any production. You have resources, and you have materials, and you have energy. Yes, you combine materials and energy, whether it is labor, other inputs, and energy. But you have a third input into production, and that is knowledge. Knowledge is required to bring these together, to combine them in certain ways to make a useful product. Suppose we increase the knowledge content, can we reduce the material and resource, the material and energy intensity of the product in that way? By substituting, shall we put it in another term, software for hardware? You know, the new Chevrolet car, which is not yet on the market, has more lines of computer code than a Boeing or an Airbus has. So you can imagine how much knowledge there is into a small car, which is more computer intensive, more software intensive than, say, a plane. The new smartphones we all use, 3/4 of the value of a smartphone is its software. A very small portion of it is the hardware. So if the software component keeps increasing, the knowledge component keeps increasing, in one way or the other, we can move to increasing knowledge intensity while reducing material and energy intensity. This is a need not only because of peculiar conditions here, but it's also a need for the world as we grapple with problems of the global climate change and warming, etc. We have to move towards lower intensive use products. This is also what we call, now where are the markets for this? Yes, there is a huge market. This is what used to be called by Prahlad. He called it the bottom of the pyramid, but we nowadays, in a more politically correct way, we call it the base of the pyramid. Nobody likes to be told that they are at the bottom of the pyramid. Base of the pyramid sounds much better. But what is this base of the pyramid market? It's a high volume, but low value and low margin market, where you need products which are engineered in that manner, which reduce costs. Now, a number of things have been done in this. You know, the low-cost smartphones, which are taking over. In South Asia, the mode of access to the internet is through the phone and not through the PC, which is very expensive. America can do that, the OECD countries can do that, but the poor countries of the world, South Africa, or rather Sub-Saharan Africa, the mode of access is going to be the smartphone, and not the Apple, but the low-cost smartphone. The Indian IIT at Chennai has come up with a rural ATM, which only requires 5% of the energy of a regular ATM. It's now selling across South Africa, across Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have a low volume market for a ATM. So the drip irrigation being done by JN Irrigation in India, which has been, downsized the drip irrigation to a small family farm, which is what we have in South Asia. This is also selling very well in Africa. So the point is, we have to move to innovating for this area, and there is a market. As you always see, whenever you're entering a new market, go into those areas which are not well established. Everybody does that. When the Chinese telecom equipment companies, Huawei and ZTE, moved into telecom equipment supply, they first went to Africa and they supplied the African markets. Then they went into other areas, and now they are the world leaders after Alcatel and Cisco. So the point is that we have to move into these markets which are there, use them with meet their needs with innovative products, and push in this manner. Then only can we really establish a made in South Asia brand. I don't think we can just go the route of trying to say, outcompete China by being lower wage or so on. That's not going to happen. The question is to move away from simple productivity concerns to that of innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. You've spelled out a lot of things that should be done. I'd like my panelists to take that as a platform and then really ask ourselves, how is it going to get done? So I'm going to turn next to a panelist from Australia, Edward Archibald. Edward is the head of SAES in Sri Lanka and Maldives. Are you based in Colombo or in Delhi? In Colombo. Very good. So then you have a very close perspective on what's going on, certainly in Colombo. I think we need a microphone.
Thanks. That's switched on. So I am based here, but I must note I'm actually representing people from the headquarters who were unable to travel here. So the comments that I'm making today are based on my colleagues in a regional program, which is I'm responsible for a bilateral aid program in Sri Lanka and Maldives. But the comments have been prepared particularly with regard to our regional program. It's the first time that AusAid is, just some introductory remarks, it's the first time that AusAid is supporting the South Asia Economic Summit, so we're delighted to be part of it. It's obviously a very important event to discuss the critical economic development challenges in the region, and particularly grateful to IPS for inviting us to be part of the dialogue. Thank you very much. Also just like to congratulate CPD on their thematic paper for the session, and provides a substantial contribution in expanding our understanding on competitiveness, issues across the region, and also serves as a very substantive resource for key data and analysis. We were provided with a list of questions. There were 8 questions, and so I'm going to be commenting on the third and the fifth, which relate to views on key constraints and possible policy priorities for promoting competitiveness in the regional and global context. And just to go back to my earlier comment, the comments are related particularly to the east corridor of South Asia, so Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and northeast India. Before I turn to the issues of the main constraints, I just want to say that we're sort of looking at these main economic challenges, the structural economic trends in the region, and the potential demographic dividend. We see addressing competitiveness issues should support, firstly, job creation and skills development. Secondly, strengthen manufacturing, jobs in the growing services sector, and increased agricultural productivity. Thirdly, diversification of products and markets, and fourthly, value addition. So the overall challenge is how to make trade work for development and in a way that benefits people, particularly in the economic periphery. Addressing this challenge requires a collective regional effort, particularly in addressing the biggest source of regional trade costs in the form of non-tariff barriers, which I think is the subject of one of the other parallel sessions. So turning firstly to the main constraints. The 2013 Global Competitiveness Report shows the importance of addressing basic requirements for competitiveness in the region, mainly infrastructure related, particularly energy and transport, which present as binding constraints, together with political and governance issues. In addition, the CPD paper provides a good overview of the need to address market failures in critical areas, which also impact on competitiveness, finance, information, marketing. So we'd like to focus on the issue of developing commercially viable export production chains and production networks, which will strengthen the competitiveness of South Asian enterprises. Comments which are similar to what my other fellow panelists have already made. Competitiveness is increasingly dependent on the number of specific production capabilities and the ability to coordinate all related inputs and retain access in particular markets. So a value chain approach suggests that improvements in the region would need to consider the following: the physical transfer of raw materials and products from suppliers to final markets, for example, transport infrastructure. Secondly, the transactions required to undertake the transfer, meeting standards, safety of logistics services, customs and related procedures. Thirdly, the information exchanged to complete the transactions, coordinate transfers and monitor demand and supply of output during all stages of production, for example, market-related data, traceability. Key capability and coordination gaps in South Asia which impact competitiveness from an integrated value chain perspective, we see 4. Key inputs, for example, energy, finance, information, cannot be sourced at a reasonable time and cost where value can be added to a product. Secondly, lack of capabilities to meet product quality standards, which prohibit market and export diversification. Thirdly, small producers do not attain sufficient scale to satisfy export market cost and quality requirements, hence little incentive to upgrade and invest. And fourthly, lack of cross-border coordination to facilitate seamless movement of goods results in high trade costs. Turning to the policy priorities, I've got 3 main things to propose. A focus on bundling of inputs for small-scale producers around production centres to help achieve economies of scale in higher value-added products. To support consolidated approach to product monitoring and traceability systems from the import source. Clustering support for small producers in a few different ways. Investment in things such as processing facilities and ways to support producer cooperation and coordination. Secondly, support for processing activities to access reliable logistics services and export finance and guarantees. Second main policy proposal, targeted support for building capability of small-scale producers and SMEs. For instance, supporting the quality assurance of infrastructure and assurance systems with international recognition. supporting initiatives such as tailored market information platforms, can possibly integrate with border and customs information systems. And thirdly, national or regional branding to help reduce reputational risk associated with small firms exporting substandard goods. Third policy proposal, seamless movement of goods through enhanced coordination. This is critical to reducing spoilage and maintaining quality of perishable exports, and to reducing delivery times and inventory holdings. Investments in storage such as bonded warehouses, for example. Improvements to the transport corridor connectivity, especially road and rail, plus inland waterways where possible, for instance between Bangladesh and India. And finally, reduce costly at the border procedures and put in place a transit agreement. If I can conclude just by saying that we see investment in supporting cross-border corridors, transit and trade links, combined with supporting backward linkages to SMEs, along production networks can help strengthen producer capabilities, can connect economic productive activities in the periphery to such activities in the centre, leading to more inclusive growth in terms of higher productive employment, incomes and consumption. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very fulsome menu of things that need to get done in the supply chain, all the way from sourcing to actually putting your goods in the hands of your consumer or client. So we're getting a lot of the kind of things that my namesake in the last session, Suresh Shah, said, we kind of know about, but we aren't getting to why it's not happening. So I'm going to urge my panelists again, and I hope in the opening up of the conversation, we can talk about the politics of it. Is it genetic? Is it entrepreneurial? Is it the climate? Is it the temperature of the tropics? What is it? So I think it'd be really nice to be able to get into some of the key elements that ought to be discussed at the next economic summit. And we hopefully will have many more private sector participants at that point. So I'm going to urge now my next panelist, who is very appropriately, and I think, placed to comment on this. I'm going to ask Sunil Wijesinha, who is the president of the National Chamber of Commerce of Sri Lanka, to talk about why in the Sri Lankan context, if it isn't happening, why?
Yeah, first of all, let me tell you that I will focus my remarks more on the enterprise level competitiveness. As you know, Sri Lanka is transiting from a factor-driven economy to efficiency-driven economy. And what made Sri Lanka competitive in the past, maybe in the last couple of decades, is no longer relevant today. Having been an industrialist myself, I could say that we had the advantages of low labor costs, subsidized energy, regularly depreciating rupee exchange rate, and even inflation we were not worried about because it was regularly taken care of by the depreciation of the rupee. And also we had the other access to markets with the GSP, GSP plus facility and so on. Today the situation has changed. No longer are we having low cost labor, and no longer are we having plenty of surplus labor, because the unemployment figure is very low, and many industries are finding it very difficult to recruit labor in Sri Lanka. We also find that we no longer have subsidized energy. It's still a little bit subsidized, but we can't rely on that. And although some of the access to markets like GSP are there, we lost the GSP plus, which was a huge benefit that Sri Lankan industries had to Europe. And also the exchange rate had been stable until the last couple of months, and that also did not give any benefit. Now, if you look at the competitiveness at enterprise level, what I would see is that we haven't really made use of many of the thinking and the facilities that was commenced purely for the Asian region. The Asian Productivity Organization set up in 1961 purely to address this issue of productivity and competitiveness. It is an intergovernmental body having many programs to promote productivity and competitiveness in the region, but somehow Sri Lanka had not made full use of it. And as a result, if you even compare with what I have seen in India and Pakistan and perhaps even to some extent in Bangladesh, you find that they have, particularly in India, many organizations promote various techniques of productivity, and at conferences and seminars and conclaves that I have attended, I can see a lot of this being disseminated, but not so much in Sri Lanka. In fact, APO itself was worried about this and started taking some action, but still the efforts are, I would say, minimal. Other thing, Sri Lanka being a small country, the supporting industry is very weak. And many industrialists find that even for small things like getting a mold made or certain other components, they have to either go to India or somewhere else, because we don't have that supporting industry well developed in this country. We also find that even when companies export, even to get the export certifications like the quality certificates and so on, we do not have accredited laboratories in this country. And very often it is either done in Hong Kong or to some extent in India. And so we need, if you look at the SMEs, once again, the SMEs also have been at very, very basic levels, and there has been no major sort of a campaign to help SMEs. I was fortunate to listen to a presentation by SME Corp of Malaysia, and wonderful work they do. We don't have a mechanism like that to develop the SMEs. Interest rates is another huge drawback in Sri Lanka, where the interest rates, if you, based of course on your risk profile, but it can go up to about 20%, unless it is on a credit line where you can get, say, single digit interest rates. And this is something that is brought out constantly by industrialists, the high interest rates, plus the inability for industries to get long-term project funding. Many of the financial institutions are not willing to grant long-term loans, because it's much easier and profitable for them to finance trade. Especially for SMEs, there is a huge lack of venture capital, because in the absence of easy access to finance, I think the venture capital mechanism has to be developed, and that is also something that is lacking in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. If I were to hazard a guess, I would, and maybe this is not correct, so I hope in the discussion we can turn to this. But if I look around at firms in all our countries of South Asia, my sense is that Sri Lankan firms have probably done the best in terms of moving up the value chain, in terms of responding to both domestic resource availability and constraints and external changes in the environment. I used to come to Sri Lanka in the mid-80s and buy clothes for my children in Delhi. And of course now everybody comes to Sri Lanka and buys Victoria's Secret lingerie. And so that's the move up the value chain that has happened. Speak for yourself, Sanjay.
I am speaking for myself.
But it does show you how the world is changing, and I have a sense that Sri Lankan enterprises have perhaps done the best. So that might be something we might want to come back to. I'm going to turn now to Mia Mikic, who is at ESCAP in Thailand as the Economic Affairs Officer. Mia.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad I'm part of this panel because I'm learning a lot. Obviously, I'm not in the private sector, nor I'm in the government, but somehow we put our nose in everything, being in UN, and so we think we can add value to what is discussed, and let's hope we can truly do so. I think I'm supposed to use the mic, I guess. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. I think Rashmi opened very well reminding us that the definition of competitiveness has actually changed, and that in this modern time, competitiveness does not depend anymore on just the sheer labor cost or the cost of intermediaries or the material side of the production, but also on the input or the share of effectiveness of production of knowledge. And knowledge services in particular, and I think if we are not ready to accept that the competition as a concept, as a notion, has changed, then our policies and our actions, whether they are at the macro level or micro level, will be not doing the right thing and not having correct impact. Just as a way of also taking it a little bit further, we used still to talk about, and I think even in this event, about industrialization, right? While most of the world is talking about servicification, being a phenomenon in which manufacturing is increasingly dependent on using services in being competitive, in producing competitively, and being integrated in the value chains. And just if you look at the amount and type of services that are actually provided to manufacturing, both in-house and being outsourced, you can come up easily with 40 plus type of services that are necessary to run manufacturing as part of the supply chain. If you are producing just a metal coming out, down the pit, it's less complicated. But if you want to be in a manufacturing sector, then you actually depend more on services than everything else. And as a way of example, and recently they have calculated. Obviously, we know all. The example of iPad or previously the cars, etc. But a simple jacket that is actually produced in China, and sold in the United States for $104. Right? When you see what is included, then less than 15% of that is in manufacturing, and everything else is in pre-manufacturing services like design, branding, etc., and in after-sale service distribution and all of these things. The smiley that was mentioned here. So this is where the value that is to be captured lies, and less and less of that is in manufacturing. That unfortunately somehow still is at the center of many of the policymakers as the most important area of economic activity. From there, I would want to connect to what Rashmi said in terms of the value of building regional value chains and sourcing and the sourcing of inputs for these regional value chains. I want to point to two things. One, she said that they were able to find 3 examples for the regional value chains. And the reason why it is such a low number is that it's very difficult to do regional value chains. If you look at the successful examples of the Southeast Asia, they are not sub-regional, they're not in the context of Southeast Asia. They actually start from outside the sub-region and they end up from in the destination that is outside the sub-region. So it is the matter of accepting that truth that you cannot build it very successfully in many of the products or services within the very narrow context of the sub-region. And then the obstacle of, even if you try to do it with the sub-region, is why you can't source these inputs. And I would like here to refer to our analysis of the reasons why not. You are all aware of the number of regional trade agreements. I have prepared some slides, but obviously we cannot use them, that are called noodle ball. And they very well can explain how the such multiplicity of you can see them there, and they may appear as, we have 150 regional trade agreements in Asia Pacific, right? And they may be looking at connecting countries, but can you put the second one, please? But they actually are fragmenting the region, because what you can see here is the parts of Asia being connected through these agreements or not. And you start on the top with Southeast Asia together with China, Korea, Japan, etc., which form these value chain that exist, right? And then all the other sub-regions sit separately, being not connected with each other. And the obstacle that these agreements that are put in there by policy makers, not really consulting with private sector on how to do it, is that the rules of origin that they actually use for the preferential treatment that firms should be utilizing in the end are so rigid and not facilitating trade, that either make a firm to have to source the inputs that are more expensive just in order to use the preferences, but even with the preferences it wouldn't be efficient, or actually to not use the agreement and go by most favored nation rules, which is what the firms do. And the utilization of the preferences of these agreements is very low in most of the agreements. Even in ASEAN, that is being portrayed here as the most efficient form, it is ranging between 30 and maybe 70% in some sectors, like car sector, right? So I think what I have noticed in this summit and in our work is the linkage in consultation between the policymakers. They may have good intentions, but they do not consult private sector when they make policies for the private sector to use, nor do they consult other stakeholders, creators of knowledge. The education sector is one of the most important sectors for the future, and this is where we need to actually combine all these players together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia. I'm now going to turn to Mohammad Razzaque, who is advisor for trade at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And again, I want us to focus on, and given that you look at Commonwealth countries across the world, how the plethora of Commonwealth countries in this region are performing relative to the rest of the world, and why the differences?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. After 5 speakers, you can imagine all good points have been exhausted. So I'm left with, I think, some, few not very, relevant points. But I'll try to make the answer to your question. Please allow me first to make a broad issue. The issue is all about how, in general, economists explain the trade or the bilateral trade flows. We have known economic geography models, and one popular thing is what is called the gravity model. Here, one of the key parameter is distance, which is basically a proxy parameter for understanding the cost of trading. Now, the issue is, in most of the regression analysis, in all regression analysis, the effect of distance between countries has got adverse implications for trade flow, which is pretty well established. The thing that has been kind of subject matter of discussion is that whether over time that particular effect has weakened because people are arguing that we have seen globalization, we have seen the revolution of ICT. So whether we have been able to kill that distance factor. There are different estimates, but more kind of a recent estimate would tell us that in the last 30 to 35 years, the effect, the adverse effect of distance, like how far countries are, have reduced. I mean, the effect on trade has been reduced by about 11%. If we drill down those estimates, then we find that of these 11%, almost exclusively all this effect is due to the trade between the advanced developed countries. For developing countries, I mean, they have failed to more or less kill this distance effect. As a result of this, some people are suggesting that we have seen that the trade between developing countries has increased. Sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned in one of the conversations we have seen, and also in other parts. Now the implication is that for South Asian countries, we think that hasn't happened. Because naturally we would feel that South Asia, the distance factor should not be dominant. But given the fact, the kind of non-tariff barriers we see, the kind of lack of trade facilitation measure we see. Now think about it in this way. If we consider for the time being that all NTBs are also kind of creating a distance factor, then I would think, imagine, and this is also kind of a part of our ongoing work, so I won't be able to give you the exact number now, but if we have to project that number, given what the South Asian countries are trading amongst themselves, and what the South Asian countries are trading with the rest of the world, then this distance between South Asian countries are going to be enormous. It could be something like, India is here and another South Asian country is in Antarctica and something like that. So then you fit nicely with the gravity model. Or it could be completely different planet, Mars or Moon. So that's one thing I would like to. So we need to kill this distance factor. This has also come up pretty strongly in the World Bank study. Dr. Sanjay Kathuri has led the study. We know that. Where they are going that, okay, if you consider trade facilitation and then say what's going to happen, trade results are pretty enormous. So we need to kill the distance. That's my first point. My second point is with regards to the supply chains. Rashmi has alluded, one of the projects that we did with UNCTAD, and it was on textile and clothing. Briefly, I will summarize the results. We have seen that supply chains do exist within South Asian countries. One concrete example, in the context of Sri Lanka, for example, we have identified certain disaggregated textile and clothing items where we think supply chains exist. For example, in those identified sectors, Sri Lanka is importing from the global market. The imports is about $330 million. Of this, $95,000 is actually being procured from South Asian sources, which is about 29%. Sri Lanka is kind of importing 29% of its raw material needs from the South Asian sources. Now, if you look at how much South Asian countries are exporting, then you will find that only about 8% of South Asian countries' global exports is being imported by Sri Lanka. So in a sense, the South Asian countries are in a position to supply all the Sri Lankan requirements. Now, why that is not happening? And we spoke to the industry people, and they gave us basically 4 points. And here again, this will add to the distance factor that I mentioned, implicit distance factor. Therefore, say the banking transaction is a problem. I mean, these are the responses provided by the industry people. The second thing, this is sometimes the buyer's restriction. Buyers will tell you what to procure your raw materials from. So this is again a kind of a value chain problem, and maybe this can develop further. Then of course some people suggested that the land-based borders are cannot be used in South Asia. So many obstacles in using the land, but that is also creating problem. And of course there is apprehension about the trade policy changes. So that is one thing. Now, the other thing is, for example, in the context of South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, they are LSAs. They get duty-free quota-free market access to the European Union. So one natural question is, why other countries, we haven't seen that much investment flowing from India and Pakistan to Bangladesh? Why? Again, this boils down to a single question, because we consider ourselves neighbors, but the implicit distance is very high, be it non-tariff barriers, be it lack of trade facilitation measures. Now let me quickly make one interesting point, and then if I get a couple of minutes, probably I'll touch upon another point. Recently, if you look at the data on some of the trade figures, then one problem, again, let me first go back to the basic economy. One way of explaining the trade, what is happening or what countries exports, is to consider what is known as the in economics, hexagonal in theory, because it all depends on what kind of factor endowment you have. So if you take that point, then countries like Bangladesh, for example, Nepal, they are rich in relatively on-scale workforce. So we would expect them to export, those kind of labor-intensive products. Now, what Bangladesh has done successfully in that context, the government export, but it has kind of, exerted some significant cost for the country. For example, the terms of trade effect for Bangladesh has been severe, which has not been highlighted or is not being highlighted these days. If you give me the figures, if you consider 2000 terms of trade index for Bangladesh 100, then in the latest 2012, the Bangladesh's figure is something like only 53. And so it has got huge potential, loss of export earnings, what the country can do in terms of importing from the rest of the world. Now the point is, then what is the option for Bangladesh? One option is, and also for Nepal and other countries, to move into the higher value added item that what Dr. Shah mentioned earlier. But here the problem is, without considering the skill development of the laborers, you cannot perhaps go into that labor, and that will tell from the hexagonal theory, because you need to have that skill component. Now, how do you break into that thing? Now, we know India, that is relatively, has got better endowment of skilled workers, also Sri Lanka. And that is one possible way in the medium term could be for Bangladesh to facilitate the movement of labor from South Asia. That is taking place to some limited extent. Like I have seen, Sri Lankan engineers, Indian technicians are working in Bangladesh, but there is no formal policy. It has not been formalized. So in a position, we are not able to take advantage of moving up to the value chain as fast as possible, or it could be possible. So here again, I think the lack of cooperation in South Asian countries is affecting. Those are my 3 points. If I get another couple of minutes, I'll allude to another point that I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Razzaque. I think you're getting to some of the issues I hope we can really dig into in the discussion. And I think you raised some very important, very practical issues where the lack of understanding between our governments and the inability to allow the private sector in each country or each set of countries to set up relationships on their own is posing a serious handicap to moving forward. My last panelist is Shiro Armstrong, Research Fellow at the Crawford School at the Australian National University. Australia, as some of you may know, has very recently has formulated a policy of look to Asia, and a very important white paper, Australia and the Asian Century, has been put out, which really sets out a very serious agenda for Australia to remain engaged and to actually deepen that engagement with the countries of Asia. Underlying that are some of the very sets of things that we are discussing, and it'd be great to hear from Shiro on some of these things.
Thank you, Shekar, and thank you to IPS and the organisers for hospitality. This has been a fascinating panel, as has the morning session. What I want to talk about really is the East Asian experience and contrasting that with a bit of South Asia, and specifically the trade policy strategies and the environment in which trade liberalisation has taken place, and hopefully drawing out some implications for South Asia. So I think it's quite well known that South Asia has the lowest intra-regional trade shares globally, and contrast that with East Asia, which has, by many measures, some of the most, is one of the most integrated regions globally. So that's the starting point. And East Asia is a very diverse region. I'm talking about Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, full of countries at different levels of development, different political systems, and still with a lot of political tensions between a lot of these key bilateral relationships. And really the story, to cut to the chase, in East Asia is the development and integration of these countries into the regional and global economies. Has come from commitment to an open, robust, multilateral trade regime, a global trading system. And in East Asia, as was mentioned earlier today, really was the economic imperative that was the political imperative. So that's how, I think we can expand on that later, but how East Asia became so integrated by committing to an open trading regime. The current state of play is with a weakened WTO, with a stalled Doha round, really global trade rules and norms that are outdated. They're designed for trade in goods a couple of decades ago, not trade in tasks, and also the proliferation of free trade agreements. I'm glad Mina put that picture up, and I couldn't agree more with her conclusions. FTAs have not delivered deeper integration for Asia, for East Asia. There is just a lack of evidence there. And so there's been a rethink in the region, in East Asia, Asia Pacific especially, on how to move forward given this context of the global trading regime and the free trade agreements that undermine the core principle of non-discrimination. And the result is a couple of mega-regional trade agreements I just want to touch on. So the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So I'll get to these in a second, but the key question for me is can these two agreements further integrate members into the regional and global economies, or will they be stumbling blocks towards multilateral trades? There's really a key moment here where there can be building blocks or stumbling blocks towards multilateral trade. And I would argue that non-discriminatory trade is no less important today in providing confidence to countries to continue to open up, to continue to deepen economic integration, and keeping them from sliding into protectionism. And I think post-global financial crisis, we saw a nice example of the global trading system being fairly robust in stopping a lot of countries sliding back into protectionism. But also provides an opportunity for new players. I'm talking about SMEs, but also developing countries to join the global production networks and supply chains. These production networks and supply chains, which South Asia are not part of nearly as much as East Asia, I think it's worth mentioning that these supply chains are not there because of free trade agreements, but despite free trade agreements, which are carving up the region. They've got different rules and rules of origin that make trade more complicated, not easier. So just back to the TPP and RCEP, which are the two major initiatives in the region. The Trans-Pacific Partnership with 12 Asia-Pacific economies, United States, Australia, Vietnam, Japan, I think many of you know the list of countries, is aiming for high standards. It's very much seen as pushed by the United States. They're in round 19 of negotiations. They keep missing deadlines. It's a very complicated agreement that is pushing for high standards. But importantly, it's a single undertaking, take it or leave it deal, which isn't so congenial for countries to join or to push their particular interests at different levels of development. On the other hand, regional RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is much more congenial for developing countries and less developed countries to join. It's comprised of the ASEAN +1 FTAs with China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand and India. It's an attempt to consolidate these ASEAN +1 free trade agreements, and this is not an easy task. There are not too many examples, pretty much zero, in the region of free trade agreements being consolidated. What usually happens is we just add more noodles to the noodle bowl, as Mia showed. RCEP, though, has a real opportunity, I think, to further economic integration in the region by changing the mode. And I think this is in early stages of negotiation, and there's been a really big push, I think, from some of the think tanks in East Asia to change the mode of negotiation in RCEP. And it's important that these are living agreements, and I think this is the key here, that negotiations are aimed at finishing in 2015. I think the aim there is to finish the first stage of negotiations in 2015, yet set goals for 2025, which are consistent with ASEAN Economic Community goals, which are non-discriminatory, focused on unilateral liberalisation, that really look at the connectivity agenda. And that is not discriminatory. That is fixing your regulatory systems at home, making your borders more efficient, and so forth. So I'm running out of time. Just quickly, I think the key implication I draw is that South Asian countries need to deepen integration with the global economy in order to deepen integration with its own South Asian economy. The key here for me is national and unilateral initiatives aimed at global integration that will help regional integration. I'll just finish with a few examples here of bilateral relationships where this is really apparent to me. Obviously, India-Pakistan is a relationship where MFN is struggling to get MFN status. You look at East Asia, where Taiwan and China now have a normal economic relationship, yet political distances still widen. And Japan-China, where there's still political tension, yet it's the economic relationship, the commitment to the global system, and integration into the regional and global system that has really put the politics on ice and let the economics dominate the politics. So thank you.
Thank you, Shiro. And thank you for reminding us that in even thinking about trade competitiveness and the competitiveness of our firms, we ought not to lose sight of what's going on outside and actually use that to leverage change within the region. I think we've got some excellent contributions by my 6 panelists, and very nicely they've come in all on time. So we have about half an hour to 40 minutes to open it up completely. Let me just start by reading something we just got this morning, which is the World Economic Forum's competitiveness report. And except for Sri Lanka, the picture is pretty dismal. Sri Lanka has jumped ahead of the rest of the region. India has slumped by a number of rankings. Pakistan has slumped by a number of rankings. Nepal and Bangladesh have kind of remained stuck where they were. And the one paragraph that this report throws out says inadequate transport and energy infrastructure, deep-rooted and widespread corruption, low education standards, red tape, access to finance, and low levels of technological adoption are among the most important competitive challenges of vast majority of the South countries. That kind of spells it out for us, and Razzaque has talked about, and everybody on this panel has talked about what's wrong, and how we might think about a set of things that come out of this panel discussion that can hopefully be factored into whatever comes out as the communique out of this summit, that really puts on notice our governments and in some sense our business associations that the train is traveling, and if we don't get on it quickly, we really run the risk of losing whatever ability we might get into new ways of our production networks, new ways of organizing ourselves, new ways of cooperation, both with the outside world and therefore with the region. So that's a very pessimistic view of, or a very cautionary view of how we might think about the next couple of years. But I do think they're really vital, because the world environment is changing so rapidly, and if we don't change along with it, perhaps even at a faster pace, we really do really run the risk of missing the opportunity of a lifetime. Then with that, let me open it up. I'll take questions, and then we'll just make it a very interactive roundtable. Yes, please. And just announce yourself, because I think we need a microphone if you're going to tape all this. I think you need to keep one, and they'll circulate another one. The gentleman here in the second row, please. Just announce your name so that they can get it on the mic.
Gautam Vora from Development Research and Action Group. My question is directed to Rashmi. She made an almost passionate plea that we should develop a value chain. And she gave the example of China, that we are losing out to China not only internationally but at national level. Now my question is whether the policy structure exists within the region to encourage that. The second point you made was that to increase production. Now again, the same point. The private sector, as has been pointed out in the plenary and other sessions, is into essentially rent seeking. Do we have the wherewithal, not only in the private sector, but even the labor productivity and labor discipline to go in?
The answers to all your questions are no. So we all know that. So there's no point of rhetorical questions. Really ask yourself the question, or ask Rashmi the question, why? And how we get there. Okay? I think that's far more important.
Let it be why then, let it be why.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, Rashmi.
Should it wait?
Let me see. Let me take 2 or 3 questions, and then we can perhaps then have a more of a round table. Yes, please. Microphone.
Shekar Shah of Afghanistan. Thank you. Batija Shah of Afghanistan. I'm wondering, this morning's session that we covered and we discussed almost all aspects of issues. The conclusion was that South Asia somehow not moved, both at the government level, at the policy levels, and so on. While such efforts will continue and should continue, but could we not take one little bit other side of it? Pretty much when we said innovation, the IT sector taking over some new ideas, and you capture the market share. And pretty much as our colleague from Australia said that, for a moment, forget about the regional trade, regional expansion and so on, while, as I said, we continue. Go to outside, pretty much what China did, and just build upon that and then push it to the maximum extent, because with the foreign involvement, other than the region itself, there's already vibration. There will be more enterprises that will be getting involved in it, attracting investments, attracting technology, and of course, pushing their products over there. While doing that, I think it will be possible that the South Asia trade will automatically take over. For example, an enterprise which somehow is involved in a much larger production to provide goods and services to Europe or US or Japan or anywhere else, the end of the day, as a cost-effective measure, they will go, Sri Lanka will right away go to India, India will go to Bangladesh, Bangladesh will go to, for example, some other countries and so on within the region for the services as well as the products and so on. So is there any merit, any of you can comment, I can certainly see that while this effort continues, go outside, push outside, and then let the 1,000 flowers bloom, and I'm sure within that context, much will benefit within the regions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Batija. Sanjay?
Thank you, Shekar. A few points. Shiro's comment about, unilateral and multilateral liberalization, I have a slight difference there, because I think, all countries in South Asia region have made commitments to WTO and the global trading environment, and they have asymmetric barriers against each other, both on the policy side, non-tariff measures, non-tariff barriers, and also on trade facilitation, which, Razzaque has told us that it increases distance manifold. So there is a problem. There is, at the borders, there is asymmetric hurdles against each other, which will not get solved with unilateral liberalization. I think that's a fundamental problem. Now, Shekar enjoined us to think about the whys and the hows, and so I'll take a stab at that. But before that, I'll just make a comment on Mia's point about services. And I thought there's a bit of a paradox there, that South Asia is a leader, or is an outlier almost in terms of its share of services in GDP. Right? In many poor countries of South Asia, very high shares of services, and yet, the efficient services which should go into manufacturing competitiveness do not exist. So I'd like your comment on that, logistics services, design services, that whole gamut of things which go into manufacturing competitiveness, very important point that you made. The why question, Shekar, I think I'd like to ask all of us is, are governments in South Asia really interested in competitiveness? There is a, so there is a rhetoric. Of course, there's a rhetoric versus a reality. India grows at night can only go so far. It can't take you, after a certain point.
This gets to the very difficult problem we face in all our countries, the difference between the de jure and the de facto. The de jure, yes, of course, we are all, really all for gung-ho competitiveness, but de facto, on the ground, at the border, what do we do or don't do?
So I have one suggestion in the context of this: how can we make South Asian governments more accountable? I have one suggestion for this forum, because that's the role that a forum such as this, which at the moment, as we've heard, is a more academically oriented session, and that's kind of a framework, and that's fine. And if we accept that, I think it is incumbent on South Asian economists, what Suresh Shah said. Let's get much more into advocacy mode, and much less into the research mode. Of course, research is the bedrock, foundation of advocacy, but I think it just stops. The research stops at research. There is so little of advocacy in South Asia in terms of real sophisticated advocacy, not just, doing a workshop or seminar, but reaching out to governments and really telling the people about the costs of not having competitiveness policies that, which cause, massive shortfalls in, poverty reduction and growth targets, So he said, well, if you had followed such and such policies, that's where you would have gone. Reaching out to people and willing and politicians who are willing to listen to those kinds of messages. And that cannot be one-off effort. It has to be decade-long efforts, right? But I think we need to make much stronger efforts in that direction.
So one practical question then, at the next summit, should we have, if we can get them, the trade ministers or the trade secretaries of each of these countries on a panel like this, not us, but we should be in the audience asking the questions, why, how can you forge the kinds of alliances that you need to if the entire region is going to proceed. So just a thought put out there.
Yeah,
I'm going to turn to Mr. Fizu, then I'll come round to you in the next round of questions, Mr. Fizu, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think excellent comments from the panelists. Now, I would like to add some tension to the discussion that we are having. Now, all of us, we have been, and Razzaque and Rashmi and many others have mentioned about the ready-made garments and textiles and the value chains and how can we have the comparative advantages translated into competitive advantages through the value chains. And if I take the example of Bangladesh, for example, Bangladesh was, when Bangladesh was getting into the global market for ready-made garments, it was also at the same time as a part of its industrialization policy was also promoting the backward linkage industries. 25% cash compensation support to the backward linkage if they are giving the fabrics to the ready-made garments. And then you see when the European Union was contemplating the change in the rules of origin for the oven from 2 stage to 1 stage, our ready-made garments wallahs were going to the Brussels in support of change in the rules of origin from 2 to 1, and the BTMA, the textile lobby, was going that no, don't change it. You see, so that was the under the market access initiative. So if you have 2-stage conversion for the oven, then you get zeros, in the. Yeah. So there was a tension over there. So you see that, but at the end of the day, European Union went for the change in rules of origin from 2 stage to 1 stage. But then what is important is that the export of ready-made garments, oven, it increased by 15 to 16% over the last 2 years when the change of time. And our ready-made garments was also exporting to our domestic, the textiles was exporting more fabrics to the domestic. They took the advantage also, but they were fighting for the last 10 years not to go for the change in the rules of origin, you see. So I think that we will have to, through research also show that that the existing, the value chains which are there within the country, what will happen to them. In this case, there was no detrimental impact, even though there. So I think that research has a role to play. So this is one. The second is that you see the global, the global way in which the market is operating is also changing. Previously, the orders were placed on C&M basis, cutting and making, and you will have to source from particular, as the Walmart will be telling you. But now it is shifting to FOB basis, and FOB basis means that you can source from anywhere. But that also needs our own services sector to develop. So I think that those parallel things should also be. And the third quick point is non-tariff barriers, etc. I think standard certification, etc. I think some policy initiatives like mutual recognition agreements between countries could also be very helpful. And we are not going through those types of policy initiatives. Now, those also could really address many of the non-tariff barriers if we go for example, this type of MRA among our countries, which we are not doing. Thank you.
So who wants to take a couple of questions? Rashmi, I think you had something pointed to you.
Yeah, I think we all know what is happening, and you also know why it is happening. I think how to change them, I think, should be the focus of our discussions now. When we had the industry consultation, we asked the private sector of all countries, why is it that we are able to tell you that you can source your inputs at a lower cost from the region? We are able to give you specific, at 6-digit level inputs, and you are currently sourcing it at a higher cost from outside the region. If it's going to be more profitable to source within the region, why is it not happening, and how it can happen? I think their answer was, unanimous, that it's mistrust. Mistrust between the industries, mistrust between the governments, because they don't know how what will happen tomorrow and how things will change. I think we can't keep sweeping, political economy under the carpet all the time. I think we need to address that. There was in the session, one of the plenary sessions, what are the growth changes? Media. I think media was one of the growth changes. Can we think of having a regional media? Can the South Asia Economic Summit host a network of regional media? I think media can play a very important role in addressing this question of trust deficit. So I think this is one way of how to address the problems of very qualitative problem rather than quantitative problems. And one more thing I think I'll take very quickly so that everyone has how to make our governments more accountable. I think that is very important. If the industry puts pressure on the government that we are going to benefit more if we trade more with our neighbors, I think the governments will listen, because industry lobbies, we all know in our countries, industry lobbies play a very important role. So it is important to have the industry on board, get a regional industry. I talked about a regional industry association of leather. Let's go down to the industry level. For each industry, let's have a regional industry association. Let the industry association meet. Talk among themselves, talk about what are the standards, what are the problems, and then respectively they can, in their respective countries, they can put pressure on the governments. I think I have these two suggestions to make on how.
Razzaque.
Thank you.
But you have
Okay. Now, first one, with regards to your this global competitiveness index, as has already been pointed out, I think it's not to be alarmed. It's better to understand the benchmark. But as has been pointed out, 9% growth rate in India, for Bangladesh, 6 to 7%. And if you look at the investment GDP ratio, which is just about 25 to 28%, with that kind of an investment, if we can achieve close to 7% growth rate, I think something miraculous is already happening, by the standard of developing countries. So that is an issue. But there is no room for complacency. We need to move forward. The second issue is with regard to unilateral liberalization. The point has been made, and the issue is, in some of the South Asian countries, they have made consistent progress, like India being one of the countries. Certain South Asian countries that started well, but then there has been a reversal in the policy framework. If you look at the implicit tariff rate, for example, in the context of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, recently, their tariffs have, the MFN tariffs have increased. Now, each has got serious implications. Like that means, if we are trading regionally under some tariff preferences, then there can be serious, trade diversion, and that has got huge welfare consequences, and we need to take into consideration of that thing. Quickly on advocacy, I fully consider that issue, that we need to go for advocacy. That's very important. I also take Rashmi's point that if the industry, they are putting the pressure. But here the problem is sometimes the policymakers, this is the serious problem in the political economy of trade policy making that we are all aware of. Sometimes the policymakers, they will be confused because different industry groups will be lobbying for different things, and the policymakers are simply clueless, like which road to take. Because there are trade-offs. The policymakers, they don't have infinite number of options. So basically, then they will have to make a choice, and that choice will eventually depend on informed kind of policy making. So that capacity will have to be built, so that the policymakers, they can merit the cases based on the information, and then they can take a decision. So that will, normally if the industry, they're coming together and going for inter-regional trade, going to build competitiveness, that's not an issue. The same thing happened in the context of textile clothing, because the way we looked into the scenario, we didn't consider any preferences within the South Asian country at all. We just took it as this tool at the time. No tariff preference, no subsidies, nothing. Whether South, yes, we were lucky in a sense that in the context of textile clothing, we could find the scope of building supply chain. But that particular result might not be replicated for other sectors. And then there is this issue of policy choice by the South Asian policymakers. So basic advocacy certainly, but at the same time, building the capacity of the the Minister of Commerce officials, for example, so you can take the right kind of policy. Thank you. Dave.
Okay, I have 2 points to make. One is, I think that we should look a little ahead, and we should see why is Bangladesh not sourcing its fabrics from, say, India or from the region. First of all, the lead firms don't come from India or the region. The lead firms or these tier 1 firms that really determine your sources of supply are in East Asia. Now, Li & Fung is the major company that is the intermediary company that supplies perhaps half of the world's traded garments, and that's a Hong Kong company, and they tell you from where you should buy your inputs. So the lead firms are not in India, are not in South Asia. That is why we do not have a South Asian regional trade. That's the first important point. Secondly, where then can we go? That's why I place the question of innovation. We can't just replicate what happened in East Asia. That's happened. You're not going to be able to do that. You can't compete with China by trying to make cheaper products of the same type that they make. You can if you innovate, if you come up with something new. And this is why I pointed to the question of the high volume, low value, low margin market, which is there in South Asia. The base of the pyramid, and is growing in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is also growing as fast, even faster than Asia is. And it is producing that low-end market, the low-end, the cheap smartphone. You have to have a $100, $120, $150 smartphone. This is what people nowadays want. The Apple and the high-end Samsung, that's not it. That's going to be a niche market. So we have to go for this low value, high volume market, and that's where there's a big scope for innovation. A third point, why is Indian manufacturing not competitive? I think there's one important factor we all miss. The very high price of land. Indian land is expensive. When speaking to entrepreneurs, they tell me, look, we can't, when we buy land, we cannot manage on a small scale. Either we have to go very large scale, or we have to go very high value. And now the price of land in India is going to go up because of the act recently passed by Parliament, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing that farmers will get more. But India will not be competitive in that mundane, run-of-the-mill manufacturing. They will have to move either to very high volume, which I don't think is easy in India with all the problems we have, or to very high value.
Shekar, can
Difficult challenges. And when you look at what countries are doing, so again, the land acquisition bill is a great step forward, but the pendulum has swung all the way to the other side from what the British left behind in India in the 19th century or the 18th century. And in some ways now we're going to have to pay the costs of that pendulum having swung too far. Shiro, did you want to?
Yeah, if I
yes,
could,
please.
just really quickly.
And then I'm going to turn it back to the our audience.
Yeah, I sort of underplayed the role of regional cooperation when I spoke, ran out of time, but I think there is important space for regional cooperation. Distance does matter in trade as well as getting the conversation in the region right. So you look at what happened in East Asia with APEC or the Asia Pacific. First a discussion that yes, liberalising unilaterally is good for you if it's done in tandem. So concerted unilateral liberalisation, the gains are even larger. And that's moved to, border barriers are fairly low. Something that keeps coming up, involvement of the business community. And so there's institutionalised involvement of the business community in APEC now that is continuing to identify non-tariff barriers, other barriers to trade and investment. So I think that's an important part. And as I think South Asia liberalises, continues to identify non-tariff barriers, that's when regional trade will take off because of the distance factor. And just finally on involving trade ministers at the next South Asian Economic Summit, I think also it's important to involve policymakers from the Ministry of Commerce and Finance as well, talking about creating a more congenial environment for FDI, for example. I think a lot of these regulatory frameworks domestically, they're not just at the border barriers. So I just want to make that point.
I think that's a very important point. So And you had your hand up, and then I saw Dushni, and then I see another hand up. Since the organizers weren't able to shut down the previous session, and so we shouldn't be paying the tax, my alacrity in managing time for all of us should not be then be subsidizing my good friend Rajiv Kumar's inability to do the same. So with everybody's permission, is lunch is what is sort of waiting for us? Is that
Lunch is ready, sir.
So we were supposed to end at 12:45. Might we just go on for another 5-10 minutes? I think that might probably be okay. Please.
My name is Arya. I'm from Afghanistan. On the question of the difference between the de jure and the de facto, to me that's a contradiction between the realities we live and the values we uphold. And to me, this is an adaptive situation. This is not a situation which could be dealt with or fixed with the tools that we have in our toolbox, technically speaking. So on the question of, this is a classic mistake which usually the human race makes when we treat adaptive situations as technical situations and apply the existing capacities on it, and we fail at it. So on the way forward and what the future summits could have, to me, bringing the ministers who are senior positions of authority and who are preoccupied with politics and everything, could be a good idea to engage them in a debate and reflection. However, it may not help us look at answers that are more related to the societies that we work in and operate in. And in order for that to happen, I think we need to have a panel or maybe a plenary session on how cultural patterns of this region or in specific countries in particular contribute to these problems. For instance, corruption is a cultural issue. We don't have this region, these countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, all of us, we don't really know how to deal with corruption. Like, we have different policies and strategies for it, but it's becoming more of a cultural thing. The lack of accountable governance, I think, is an adaptive cultural situation. So we need to have culture as a cross-cutting theme, probably as a plenary session, and bring people with capacity to analyze, understand, study, and question, and help us question cultural patterns of this region. Thank you.
Thank you. Dushni?
I just want to raise a question about the objective of this session in terms of the discussion that I've heard. We are talking about competitiveness of enterprises. And at the same time, I get messages from the various panelists that we're also looking at South Asian integration, trade issues.
Other issue that I would like to quickly point out, and this has been already touched upon by Mia, is that we are only focusing on the trade-related issues, and this is in the spirit of the fact that we are also need to take into consideration regional integration or cooperation. There are other areas we need to look into, like think about the supply of electricity in South Asian countries. Keeping 30% population, 70% population out of electricity, you cannot promote entrepreneurial capacity. One of the traditional trade theories would tell us that why trade takes place, because there is excess production, and that excess production will end up into the foreign markets. Now 70% population they can't get integrated into the whole production process. That is also hindering us. So South Asian countries could have generated new products, brought new varieties, and throw it to the world market. That is not simply happening. So here is the question about the cooperation issues in electricity development. We have been talking about 65,000 or 100,000 megawatt electricity in Nepal. That hasn't been realized. So maybe that's the time for us to think about it.
Shiro, Ed, anything to add? No? Okay. No? All right. Well, then I just give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much, and thank you to all my panelists, and thank you to all for participating.